Good morning, all of you. Chandraprabha Saikyani Center for Women's Studies, Tezpur University welcomes you all to this birth and death anniversary of the women's right crusader Chandraprabha Saikyani today. It's her 121st birthday and 50th death anniversary, which makes her a great Mahapurusha. We say people who are born and they die on the same day, they are Mahapurushas. So we also consider Saikyani to be one. For those who know Saikyani, they know Saikyani, but those who do not have an idea of who Saikyani was, let me tell you that in the beginning of the 19th century, a little girl who was born in the year 1901 and who fought till the age of, say, 30 to 35 years, she fought for women's education, she fought for women's empowerment, she fought for women's rights. The center in Tezpur University was named after this women's rights crusader, Chandraprabha Saikyani. Though in your textbooks, maybe you had a little reference of Chandraprabha Saikyani in your history textbooks or in your literature books, maybe, but that reference is very little. And that is how Assam had tried to give this credit to this great woman who was born in the beginning of the 19th century. And the government of India had in the year 1971 conferred Padma Shri to her posthumously. Today, we have with us Professor Rohini Godbole, another Padma Shri awardee, talking to us. This center, ma'am, was started in the year, we started it, it's almost 12 years that we had started, and I joined in a few years ago. And the development of the center in this particular university, Tezpur University, has been slowly, gradually, we have been gaining momentum. We have started courses. We have a PG diploma course, we have a PhD course, and we have a couple of projects that we are working with. Along with that, just to bring in the sensitiveness, awareness, and a little bit of motivation amongst our university students, amongst the youth, we have started these credit-based courses. Like we have Women in Digital Literacy, we have Introduction to Women's Studies, and we have few other courses that we are going also to start in the future. Today is a great day for us. We will start Rohini ma'am's, Professor Rohini Godbole's lecture in a short time. Before that, I would request Dr. Vivek to kindly offer floral tributes, and all those, maybe a few of you can come and play the floral tributes. Ma'am, we will show you. We also have a bust installed in front of the center, and we completed all the preliminaries in the morning. But this is inside a council hall where we normally gather for the meetings, ma'am. So we have kept, so that you would also like to see who Chandraprabha Saikyani was, so we have kept a photograph of her, Sam. Abhijit, please.
Excellent. Excellent. नाही देखा. नाही देखा. Excellent. मैं देखा है এনেকে দেখাব লাগিব।
Yes, I can see the photograph. Thank you.
Ma'am, could you have a glimpse of her?
Yeah, I hope you could hear it. I said that I could see the photograph, and thank you. And I pay my respects from here across the net. I'm
Okay.
truly sorry not to be able to be there, but the
Yes, exactly.
situation-
We had planned where we wanted you physically to come, and
Yeah.
maybe next time, because
Maybe
we
next
understand, you know, the situation right now.
next
Uh,
time maybe.
Yes. And let's move on to, because what is important today is the lecture. So we have shifted all the preliminaries that you normally do in an event to after ma'am's lecture. We will have ma'am's lecture first, but let me tell you that everywhere we take a pledge. We take a pledge in the form of, you know, we just, I would say, continue with what Soikyani had said. In Assamese, ma'am, I am saying, আমি নাৰী সমাজৰ এনে সংগঠন আশা কৰোঁ যিয়ে তেওঁলোকক সামাজিক আৰু আৰ্থিক পৰাধীনতাৰ পৰা মুক্ত কৰি তেওঁক দেশশক্তি কৰি তুলিব পাৰে. And this is in Assamese is, we want a platform for the women of Assam from where they can be uplifted from the social and the economic inequalities that they face and can become the leaders of the nation. So this is exactly what Soikyani had also tried to do in her short lifetime. I will request Dr. Moushami Mohanto to kindly let our young students know about Professor Rohini Godbole. Ma'am, we have a short bio that we collected from the website. So a brief bio of yours will be read out. And
Thank
after
you.
that, we continue with the next. Yes, Dr. Moushami.
Good morning. Good morning, ma'am. I just want to introduce Rohini Godbole ma'am. Rohini Godbole ma'am is a particle physicist, known for her work CERN, European Organization for Nuclear Research. Her work on high energy photons could form the basis for the next generation of particle colliders used to study the fabric and the composition of the universe. She works on aspects of the standard model of particle physics, which describes the properties and behavior of elementary particles of the universe. Apart from her work in academics, Professor Godbole is also much sought after communicator of science, often delivering talks to young students, scholars, scientists on everything physics. She is also a big supporter of women pursuing careers in science and technology, and along with Ramaswamy, edited the book Lilavati's Daughter, a collection of biographical essays on women scientists from India. She is today a part of the International Director Advisory Group of the International Linear Collider at CERN, who monitors the design and working of the ILC director. She is also the chairperson of the Panel of Women in Science initiative of Indian Academy of Sciences. She is the Padma Shri awardee for her contribution in science and technology and awarded in 2019. She is the Satyendra Nath Bose Model Awardee in 2009. She also awardee of Devi in 2015. She also awardee of French government. At last, she can be, I did say to be the crusader of women in science. So we are very much proud today that the ma'am Rohini Godbole is with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohanto. So now all of us, we know who Professor Godbole is. An awardee herself, a Padma Shri awardee herself. She will be speaking. She will be giving the memorial lecture, actually, which we wanted to be a physical thing, for a Padma Shri awardee herself, Chandraprabha Saikyani. Ma'am, we have something very small to offer you. This year, we have celebrated, as I told you, the Women's Week, where we had felicitated 3 women scientists, junior women scientists also, and at the senior level also. And today, on the final conclusion day of the Women's Week, we would like to felicitate from Tezpur University, Professor Rohini M. Godbole. I would request Nigar Sultana to kindly read out the memento. And this memento will be sent along with the book of Chandraprabha Saikyani to ma'am after this.
A very good morning to Professor Rohini Godbole ma'am and everyone present here. I would now like to read out the memento. In appreciation to Professor Rohini M. Godbole, Chandraprabha Saikyani Center for Women Studies, Tezpur University acknowledges your contribution and scholarship in the field of physics. You have marked a series of exceptional footprints through your achievements. A role model for the women in the field of sciences, your life is a clear reflection of your efforts, hard work, and unwavering determination. You have instilled in the young women a banner of excellence in the field of science. Tezpur University salutes your vision, commitment, and dedication. You will be an inspiration for generations in future. Thank you.
This is something very small that we can offer to a person of her stature. Ma'am, we know you when in social sciences, we came to know about Leelavati daughters. And our teachers also had discussed this particular book, which is again a collection of different articles, different write-ups. So we have with us today Professor Rohini Godbole in front of you online, and her topic is today promoting women in science, visibility and role models. And please be cautious while you're trying to understand, because we would like to have a very positive interaction by the end of this session. Thank you, ma'am, and we switch over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madhurima, then Dr. Mohanto, and all the members of Women's Studies Center, as well as Tezpur University itself. I am truly pleased to be speaking here today and giving a memorial lecture in the memory of Chandraprabha Saikyani. And indeed, to be honest, let me say that she would be a Mahapurush even if her date of birth and the date of passing away hadn't matched. Indeed, I think when I have looked at her and read, I find that she's really a pioneer of the feminist movement in Assam, and not just in Assam, actually, but in India. And I am rather happy that in the list of, on the in this occasion of the Amrut Mahotsav, Azadi Ka Amrut Mahotsav, the government of India has actually come up with making lists of 75 scientists, 75 unsung heroes. And I have seen this particular citation for Chandraprabha Saikyani, which I have taken from this website, which is amritmahotsav.nic.in. And I was also very pleased to see this stamp, which was issued in a memory in 2002. And indeed, this life that has been described here, all too briefly, all too many achievements, is truly impressive. And I would like to begin my talk by paying my respects, my tribute to this great lady who lived, in a century where I was born in the middle of that century. I truly feel honored to talk at the Center for Women's Studies, which is named after this fearless feminist, social worker, writer, and crusader for women's rights and education. I found that she was, when I read her life, I found that she was also extremely, how should I say, progressive in her beliefs. And, it was not something that she only preached, but she practiced all that she preached. And I believe that all of us women, in fact, are now reaping the fruit of all the hard work which was done by women like Chandraprabha Saikiani. And we should really gratefully remember them in all we do. And, when we find the paths of progress that have been made open to us by now because of their hard work. And what I should really mention here is that what I find very, very impressive about Chandraprabha Saikiani is that in many of the other parts of India, the first crusaders for women's education were quite often men. And here the torch was lit by a woman herself. It required vision, it required determination, and it required enormous amount of efforts and self-belief. And I really and truly would like to salute this woman with all these attributes. So I'm sorry, Dr. Madhurima, I think there was a miscommunication, because what I wanted to talk about, I thought was appropriate, is that for a woman who fought all her life for equity and inclusion of women in all parts of life, I decided that I will take a small part of that and I would discuss the issue of equity and inclusion in science, and then particularly what role individuals, institutions, and society can play. I'm very happy to be speaking at the end of this Women's Week, and I'm happy to have discussions, if not now, at some other time with you and your group further as to what we can academically discuss on the subject. So, in my talk, first, I would try to tell you why I think equity and inclusion are important in science. Then I would go to issues specific to gender, because that's going to be a big part of the talk. And I will argue that to bring about equity, inclusion, we need both policy changes and, equally importantly, we need changes in the mindset. And then I will briefly tell how the considerations of equity and inclusion in the science, technology, innovation policy of 2020 are going to be of help in this. And I will end by making an appeal as to how achieving equity and inclusion in science needs contributions from individuals, institutions, and society. It's not the job for just one person, one institution, or one structure. So, what is the need for equity and inclusion in science? So people, people who work in natural sciences would really say, this is something that you need to discuss only in social science. But that's really not true. And first, I want to spend a few slides to tell you that equity, the role that equity and inclusion would plays for the development of science itself. So one of the motivations for equity and inclusion in science is, of course, we want to correct the historical injustices, and we want to correct for the exclusion of the different groups which were excluded because of historical reasons from processes of science. I mean, not just processes of science, also processes of life, but I'm focusing here on processes of science. But it is equally important to realize that the inclusion and diversity can only aid in increasing the efficacy of the scientific processes by adding more dimensions to the scientific ecosystem, which actually can lead to further excellence in science and technology. Now, this is not a theorem in mathematics or science that I can prove, but this is a logical chain of arguments which tells us that equity and inclusion in science is not just important for the excluded groups, but also from the point of view of science itself. So, since I use different words, I will define what I mean by different words. So, what is meant by equity and inclusion, and what is meant by diversity, and so on and so forth. So, the diversity in scientific processes means participation of different diverse groups in processes of science. It can be diversity of gender, diversity of language, diversity of social economic class, diversity of caste, diversity of geographical region, diversity of physical abilities, diversities of knowledge systems. I am going to cover the three diversities that I have put in red. I will make comments on these three. Some of the groups are underrepresented. As I said, sometimes for historical reasons or whatever reasons may be. And achieving diversity in your workforce, in your scientific workforce, actually means that you need to include those groups which were excluded, or in the case of groups which are included, achieve equity. So here I would take two examples. One is the example of traditional knowledge systems, which I think they have been excluded. And from the point of view of sustainable developmental goals, indeed, traditional knowledge systems, and particularly in areas like Assam, that's a very important issue. And then equity for those underrepresented groups where some inclusion exists, and that's like gender. So I'll try to comment on these two issues. So before I begin, I should try to answer a question: why should we be discussing diversity in science and technology together? That is, does the lack of diversity in science and technology actually influence the course of science? Another way of asking the same thing is that is diversity necessary for excellence? And I would like to actually answer this question by quoting from a letter which was signed by about 2,000 physicists in the US in 2015, and that was called an open letter to Supreme Court Justice of US from professional physicists. And this was in answer to a somewhat rhetorical question asked by the then Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Mr. Roberts. So the question asked by him was, what unique perspective does a minority student bring to a physics class? And the two answers that this physicist gave him was that one, science relies heavily on consensus about acceptable results as well as future research directions, making diversity among scientists a crucial aspect of objective bias-free science. This is equivalent to what I said, that the diversity in science adds multiple extra dimensions to the ecosystem in science. Secondly, the minority group brings their background, their ways of thinking, methods of applying physics to real-world problems. It's not just a question of having the minority or otherwise. Science is a very creative activity. So as many different types of brain, as many different types of individuals would actually contribute to science, science can only flourish better. And more importantly, the minorities groups bring in and have the potential to educate others through their unique perspective. I think with Chandraprabha Saikyani's example, one can see the potential that she realized in practice after getting school education, secondary school education as a girl by going to a school in Nagaon. She came back and she wanted to teach other girls and educate them. So this is the potential to educate others through the unique perspective of the minority. I will begin by some comments on gender equity. So one question that is asked in science quite often is that, are all people equal when it comes to all sciences? There is a very famous statement by Harvard president Larry Summers, who had merrily said that women lack capability in mathematical and physical sciences. Poor fellow, he actually believed that the research he had done supported that hypothesis. Of course, he was slowly and surely proved wrong. And it's true that in India, we don't have our Larry Summers. We don't have people telling us that women cannot do science. But at the same time, we are not inundated with women which practice science. And there was actually an investigation in October 2015 by these two authors, William Cates and Sandroni. Both are women, by the way. And what they showed in their study is that diverse groups are less conformist and they are more willing to go against the status quo if that leads to better outcomes. And I don't need to tell you that in sciences, thinking out of the box, thinking going against the status quo, is indeed one very important way in which science progresses. So they ended up concluding that whether a physics graduate goes on to work at a tech company, becomes a scientist, or ends up as a manager, it will be critical for her success as well as her employer's success whether she is an original thinker. And if the being working in a diverse environment makes you, it's more likely that you become an original thinker. That is something that can only contribute positively to development of science. Now, a next question that many people ask is, diversity among practitioners of science is really small across all sciences. And the question is, again, is that necessarily bad? And I have answered that already in the last two slides. The answer is yes. But I would once again give you one more answer. I'm going to give you different answers to these questions because there are many different ways which convinces us that diversity in science is very, very important. One answer is that it's certainly not the optimal use of humanity's intellectual potential. It's like keeping all your, capital in your locked up in half of the capital locked up in your safe. I mean, that doesn't work. Everybody will tell you pragmatically, it's best to use all your capital if you want to make progress. So diversity can only be good for science as it is for any creative activity. So I will give you 3 examples, okay, in the course of this talk. One is diversity of knowledge systems. So I already mentioned this, that use of traditional knowledge systems might be lead us to interesting innovations, which then can make important contributions to sustainable development goals. And right now, India is rather low in this list of achieving sustainable development goals. And therefore, just from that goal, we should now think of utility of using diverse knowledge systems. Second example I will give you is that of racial diversity. And I will show you that in the USA of 1960, how the African American women of the Deep South made very all-important contributions to the US space program. The third example I would give you, and that is what I will discuss in great detail, is that of the gender diversity. But I want to begin with a story. This was written by Sonia Tokesquith, who was a social scientist and anthropologist who studied at Cambridge or maybe Oxford, I don't remember. And she told us in that talk that according to anthropologists, the first calendar was a bone with 28 incisions. When you think about it for a minute, sit back and think, you realize that it was perhaps invented by a woman, because which man wants to keep track of 28 days? But till this is pointed out explicitly, we attribute the invention of the calendar to men or mankind. Now, some of the people would say that, you are being too sensitive. This is a matter only of nomenclature, semantics. But actually, that is not true. It is not just a manner of speaking. These affect the attitudes towards women in science. And I will give you some examples. It has affected attitudes towards women in science through the centuries, not just decades. Now, clearly it's silly to say that the lack of equity or lack of gender diversity has impeded development of excellent science. Because as we know, the excellent science has been mainly the science that we use today, the science and technology. It started with Sir Isaac Newton mostly, okay, for many of us. And this has been led mainly by white Caucasian males. I mean, so it's stupid to say that science has not developed in 400 years, 500 years. We have 300, 400 years. We have moved to mountains. Mankind has gone to the moon and, taken vehicles to Mars and whatnot. But what I want to ask the question and answer is that, can we point out somewhere where the lack of opportunities clearly might have caused science to lose something? That is, can achieve gender equity in future avoid such losses? And there I will give you an example of a very famous mathematician, lady mathematician. Her name was Sophie Germain. She was a French scientist. But then I also want to give you an example where gain of diversity was actually a gain of SNT ecosystem. And that is where gender and racial diversity in the workforce contributed to a gain in the scientific ecospace. And that is the example of Hidden Figures. So let me begin with the example of Sophie Germain. Sophie Germain was self-taught and she had to fight against the family and society. In fact, if you notice, when she was born and when she passed away, she was about 13 to 14 years old when the French Revolution broke out. Her father was a count of sorts, and which means a gentleman, and therefore endangered for the time of the French Revolution. And they had a chateau somewhere outside Paris, and he and his family moved on to his estate and luckily remained safe. And in that time, she actually read the books in the chateau that her father had. He was a science scholar. And then she actually taught herself in those years of revolution, and she realized that she loved mathematics. She wanted to do mathematics, but it was not considered proper. I mean, this is the attitude that I'm talking about. When you say that some inventions were of men and the mankind invented something, you literally think that women cannot do that. So it was not considered proper for a middle class girl to study mathematics and science. Family even took away candles, all kinds of things. And finally, they relented when they realized that this girl, I mean, you can see her eyes, I mean, they were full of passion for mathematics. At the same time, France actually founded one of its sort of citadels of knowledge, which is called École Polytechnique. And this is like the equivalence, I would say, of Oxford and Cambridge in France. And women were not allowed, actually. They were not allowed to be students there. So she used her notes of a cousin and used the pen name to communicate with the mathematical giants such as Lagrange and Gauss, who were great mathematicians of the time and who really appreciated the science and mathematics. And, she actually did very important work on theory of elasticity. She was the first woman to win a prize from French Academy. So why am I giving her as an example that something might have been lost? The reason is that in most of her work she did, for example, even the work which won her award, the work was sent back to her 4 times by the committee of experts by saying that it lacked rigor. And why did it lack rigor? Because she lacked the basic training, because she had taught herself. So in case, she had been allowed to study mathematics from day zero, she perhaps would have not just done important work on Fermat's last theorem, but she would have perhaps solved it. Now, this Fermat's last theorem was a theorem which actually left unsolved for 300 years and has been solved only in the last few decades. So who knows? This particular famous theorem might have been solved by her if she had been given, full opportunity to extend her horizons in mathematics. After giving you this kind of negative example, I also want to give you a very positive example. And there is this book called Hidden Figures, written by Margot Le Chatterley. I would really, recommend that you read this book. And these are hidden figures behind the US space program. And these are the 3 women, Dorothy Vaughan, Katherine Johnson, and Mary Jackson. Now all of them have passed away. Recently, Katherine Johnson passed 2 years ago at the ripe old age of 102. So Mary Jackson is the first woman engineer of color to have gone to college in Deep South. Dorothy Vaughan was the first head of the computer center at NASA. And Katherine Johnson was the woman, she was a mathematician, and who actually plotted the orbit of the vehicle, the first manned vehicle that made an orbit around the Earth, that US had sent into space. So, as you, I mean, most of you are very young to remember this or even know this, that USSR had actually won the space war, as it were, or space race, by putting the satellite with a person on board into orbit before, and that was Yuri Gagarin. This was celebrated a few, his own Memorial Day was celebrated recently. And therefore, this was a big space race that US and USSR were involved in. And the US press of the time had thought that part of the reason US was not winning the race is that it was not pressing all the talent that was available to them, and indeed employing and getting these women from the deep south, which happened because the American white men were out fighting. But indeed, this incorporation of South American, Indian, African, American, African women who were mathematics graduates, mathematics teachers, and engineers who contributed to the space program and put it on the fast track. Then I want to give you an example of traditional knowledge system and innovation. This is an example from a talk on Shodha Yatra by Professor Anil K. Gupta of Honeybee Network, Srishti. Please go and look at gyan.org. And here he gave two examples. Here, this is how to harness waste heat to dry damp wood somewhere in your vicinity in Meghalaya. And this is how they traditionally dry wood. And this is from Andhra Pradesh, where the waste heat from kitchen is used to dry the husks before they are pounded into wheat. So these are the kinds of traditional knowledge systems which we should be employing into our everyday life to achieve really the sustainable development goals. Then I want to give you the last but not the least, a very recent example of gender diversity and knowledge gain. And this is a paper that was published in Animal Behavior in 2020, just 2 years ago. And here, people actually published a paper saying that the role of diversity in science, a case study of women advancing female bird song research. And what this case study actually showed was something very interesting. You see, in general, this was assumed for many, many decades that it's only the male bird that sings, sings the courtship songs. But slowly it had, people had begun to realize that female birds also have courtship songs. And these people actually studied and found that women are making much better contribution to the emerging field of female bird songs. And this discrepancy actually demonstrates the importance of diversity in addressing previously understudied areas of science. I need not tell you that this kind of change in the perspective can actually have deep implications for the conclusions we draw about, for example, even evolution. So therefore, it is important to have diversity in science. Of course, some of you would come up and say science is objective, science is universal. Newton's law, force is equal to mass into acceleration, would not have changed even if, whether a woman had invented it or a black African had invented it or a Hindu, as people used to be called that time, and in the British resources would have invented it. Why is then diversity important? I think diversity is important because who we are affects what science we do. Issues in science, one chooses to investigate, processes that are put in place, can actually be influenced by cultural or racial or gender background. And one example I would like to give you is Shalini Arya of Institute of Chemical Technology in Mumbai. She came from a very different background than most of us. And indeed, her work on trying to create more nutritious chapatis, which will last longer, so developing an atta which will do that, was something which reflects the need of a set of group of community in society which needed to have this development. And Shalini Arya came from that group, and hence she did this very wonderful research. So who we are affects what science we do. Examples are galore, But I will tell you the first woman doctor from India who got her degree in the USA, Anandibai Joshi. She was actually predates Chandraprabha Saikiani. In her own way, she was a pioneer. And she did her thesis on gynecological problems of women because she herself lost a child at its birth when she was 14. So when she went to the US, on her eve to the travel to the US, she said, I want to go to the US and I want to learn about gynecology because I know that I don't want this fate to befall on many of my sisters who are not happy in going to a male doctor. Another very interesting news item, this was researched by a computer scientist called Joy Bulwamini in the US, and she was a media scientist in MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US. And what she found is that the facial recognition programs that people were developing using artificial intelligence were accurate only if one was white. And they were as likely as 35% wrong if one was African American woman. So indeed, in these days of use of artificial intelligence in research and social sciences as well as in hard sciences, this is clear that diversity in the workforce, diversity, the techniques, for example, the diversity in your target groups is very, very important. Then, there was another one that I had seen about 1 year ago. This was maybe 1.5 years ago when pandemic kind of introduced the need of online application forms rather than the hard forms. And then I remember that a form required writing the name of the father. And since it was an online form, this was a required field, and the person who was designing it didn't realize that in some parts of communities in Karnataka, women don't have father's name. And this is the whole group of women who are Devdasis. So one of the girls from there who was applying for some job or college admission actually used then her brother's name or her uncle's name as her father's name. So being aware of the diverse needs of the different parts of society when you are doing science, when you are doing science administration is very, very important. So I hope I have tried to convince you that diversity is intrinsically good for science, necessary for good science. It makes pragmatic and economic sense. And the science and technology innovation system is actually the beneficiary. It increases the complexity of the STI ecosystem that's being studied. So achieving gender equity or any equity and inclusion is not to be done only with a sense of correcting a historical wrong. It is not to be looked as charity to underrepresented groups so that the creative abilities get expression. This is something all of us need to remember when we think of the subject, whether it is gender equity or racial, and this affects our own response to the issue. Now I come to the last part. It's easy to see the lack of diversity and equity in science. How do we cure things? And how do we judge what level of diversity and equity is correct? Is there such a thing as correct level? And now here I want to make a statement that lack of numerical representation is a symptom, and therefore measures to increase that numerical representation is a measure. But achieving those numerical targets does not mean that the problems get solved. To solve the problems, you have to look at the roots of the issue and you have to address the reasons. So before I continue, let me say now for the gender, I will now talk about gender parity. I would say that one of the important steps in achieving the equity is to become aware that there are some reasons, some issues that are not obvious that they are the obstacles, and we need to understand those unobvious, invisible obstacles. So let me take the gender parity as an example here, and let me make a few comments, and that would be the end of my talk. Now, what are the challenges that are specific to women in science when you compare with all the other professional women? Let's discuss that. So in India, the women in science story is very interesting. There are women in education, in science, in big numbers. And this is sort of a representative data. I can show you more precise data if we have some longer discussion at some point in future. That in BSc level, master's level, PhD level, we now have and have had for last 25 years, 30 years, roughly 35 to 40% women participation. Even among engineering students, we have something close to 25% participation. But when it comes to postdoc or young faculty, there's a big drop right after the PhD. And the postdoc and young faculty in the institutions all over the country are not more than 15%. When it comes to permanent positions, then it goes down even further, and it goes down to something like 10% faculty in science. And when it comes to science leaders and high achievers, it's even less, it's like 4%. Now, this is actually consistent with the data that has been collected by UNESCO. And I'm not going to show you that, but the average fraction of the women in science in the world over is 30%, and India is way below that average, it's 15%. So in India, the problem is not just development of human resource, but it's also the human resource deployment, particularly in the context of women. So of course, not having the having the diverse workforce, we get a lot of advantages. So if we don't have women in the workforce, we will lose all those advantages. But even beyond that, it's pragmatically loss of your investment. You have invested in training these women in science and technology. The society has invested, government has invested, they have invested their time. And if we don't use it for our progress, for science, then science and technology is actually taking us on the path of progress. And therefore, the country which is committed to path of innovation-based progress cannot afford this brain drain. This is a question of low return on investment. It makes little economic sense, little pragmatic sense. So the loss of trained scientific human resource has to be plugged. Now, how do you do that? What are the obvious and visible causes for the drain? Some are very specific to science, and I want to share them and emphasize them. That in the case of all the other areas, you get a degree and you're more or less ready to start your profession. You do an MBBS, maybe 1 year of 6 months, depending on the state you live in. You have to do some social work, and after that, you're free to start doing. You can start practicing. But in science, it doesn't work that way. You have to have an apprenticeship after your PhD. You become a scientist in your own right, most importantly, by spending time, what is called the postdoctoral research. Now, this is the time when the clock of science is ticking, because you need to make important work in this period to set your own niche in science. But this is also the time the body clocks are ticking. So I call it the problem of simultaneously clicking clocks of body and of career. So these beginnings are very tender, and their help and support is very essential. There is another set of visible cause, and that's common in all the other spheres for all women who are professional, and that's family and career balance. So the question is, if we take care of these two obvious problems, will it be enough? And indeed, there are many methods, many policies that have been introduced to take care of these two obvious problems, and I'm not going to discuss them in detail. Again, as I said, someday in some seminar, we can discuss this in detail. Policies exist to come back to a career after a break. Policies exist for flexi times. Policies exist to encourage young girls to choose science and technology. Policies and training programs exist for women scientists to train them in leadership. What is the reality? Reality is that all this is necessary but not sufficient. And I will stop here at this point. I might come back and discuss if questions are there on this issue. So what is apart from these obvious causes, what is the invisible causes or unconscious problems? Those are the problems of invisible and unconscious bias. Biases about what women can do and cannot do. Biases about what women should do and should not do. And that is why I like this year's Women's Day slogan, break the bias. These biases are invisible. They are sometimes unconscious, but it impacts the mentoring that we, the senior scientists or the senior colleagues or family, give to young women. This impacts the decisions that young men and women take. And this can directly impact the number of women that continue in science and technology and also what they can achieve. I find that almost all this arise from the lack of importance that we attach to women's participation in science. That is, we meaning society and scientists and the women themselves. I learned this also in a very interesting survey that I did. And this survey was loss of scientific trained woman power. How much are we losing and why? And the interesting lesson we learned is that these invisible biases, unconscious biases that I'm talking about, are also the reason for the loss of women from the workforce after a PhD. It's not just the problem of handling family and life together. So the invisible bias very often feeds into a visible bias. And how much the bias is so unknowing and so early. I want to give an example. This is a story of a young girl. Okay, this is a girl, daughter of a friend of mine. The parents had no bias in the upbringing of the child. They had only a daughter. They have only a girl child. And they gave her a book called Joy of Making Indian Toys, written by Sudarshan Khanna. And she made only parts of the toys which were given in the book. So the parents asked her, why did you make only parts of the toys? And she said, okay, I made only those where the girls were shown making them. So now they conveyed this to Sudarshan Khanna, and he clearly now changed the cover after the little girl's comment. But this gives you an example of the invisible bias. In fact, this is not just in the Indian context, this is world over. The Royal Society in the UK displays this as a reason for disparity on their webpage itself. I would recommend your Women's Studies Center to screen a film called Picture a Scientist. It's available on Netflix, and this brings out the story of invisible bias through interviews and conversations. It's a wonderful social science study of women in science, of the gender issues in science. Actually, even more importantly, all this is not a propriety only of gender inequity. I would like all of you to sit back and think how often we do not pay attention to the suggestions of a person because he or she is not fluent in English, because he or she is from a rural background, or in India particularly, because he or she is trained in India and not abroad. So in our lives, we need to look at the content of the message that we hear in an exchange. It should not be colored by our biases about the messenger, about the messenger's language, about the messenger's social background, about the messenger's place of training, so on and so forth. Now, is that enough? Again, this is necessary, but far from sufficient. One needs advance on two separate fronts. One is policies, where you need to make policies, and you need to make sure that the policy themselves are not affected by the bias of the policymakers, of this invisible bias. Then you need to change social attitudes and conventions. Being aware of one's own invisible bias is one of them, so that when you mentor young people, you don't let your invisible biases affect the mentoring you give them. And such awareness is also essential for a successful implementation of the policies themselves, which I'm mentioning here. And luckily, we have now the Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy of 2020, which was released in January 2021. And I believe it will become a policy very soon. It will get a final sanction and seal of approval from the government of India rather soon. And it has taken a big step by having separate discussion of equity and inclusion in policies of sciences. This is realizing that the discussion of equity and inclusion cuts across all issues. Previously, we had one discussion of gender equity, another one for including those on the margins of society, third one on including people from the Northeast in the progress path, so on and so forth. A holistic approach discussing the full thing together can only take us towards our aim faster and better. And again, I repeat that the point is that the considerations of equity and inclusion should be overarching feature of all our policy discussions. The focus is on equity, not equality necessarily. The goal of equity and inclusion policy is two ways, which I already mentioned: to facilitate inclusion for groups that are underrepresented, to facilitate equity for groups where inclusion exists. And successful implementations of many of the policies that are suggested there will require institutional processes, institutional changes, institutional commitments, as well as changes in the societal processes and societal mindset. Commitment from all the different structures is essential, and that will come only from creating awareness, awareness that this whole thing is beneficial, not just for the excluded women, not just for the other excluded groups, but also for science and technology, and that it makes pragmatic and economic sense. This thinking has to become a part of our ecosystem. So my last message is introspect and autocorrect for your own invisible biases in your professional and personal lives. We need to be inclusive in all we do. And this begins at home, as to how you treat your spouse, how you treat your children. Spouse, as I said specifically, how you treat your wife, if you are a man, how you treat your husband, if you are a woman. If you have a boy child and a girl child, do you treat them equally or do you treat them differently? So it begins from home. And all of us, individuals, scientists, science administrators, we need to be inclusive in all we do. So I will end up with my last word, that the path to go to a situation when we will just speak of scientists and engineers and not their gender, that is not she is a woman scientist. So she is a scientist who happens to be a woman. I hope someday we start talking like that. But even though that is my dream, the path to go to that day is actually goes through the path of being very aware of the whole thing for a long time. And all of us, individuals, society, and the governments need to work towards this. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.
For interaction, a very short interaction. Thank you.
Now I can see the audience. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Yes.
That's nice.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. And let me apologize that I have not been able to come there in person. I would have been very happy to be there today. And maybe someday in future, we can have a discussion face to face.
Thank you, Professor Rohini Godbole. And as you said, we would expect you to be here in person so that you are there. There are a whole lot of interactions that we have. But let me just discuss what you spoke about today, which was very mind-absorbing. As I remember, since I do, what I see is that this very idea of, talking about science and talking about promoting women in science, or say in the STEM disciplines, is a very recent discovery. Otherwise, because I could never, this idea could never have been, fulfilled when the Department of Science and Technology had requested the Women's Studies Center to take it up. Because we always think the Women's Studies Center is a social science thing. So they cannot think of the sciences. This is where I think this is the crux from where we can pick it up, that it's only about fairness that we are talking about. When we are saying gender, there's nothing to worry about. It's only about fairness. It's only about that we want both the sexes to come up equally. We are talking about equity and nothing else. Ma'am, in this university, in our university, we recently had earned a project from Department of Science and Technology from not the Kiran division, the other one, that's Gati, Gender Advancement for Transforming Institutions, ma'am.
Yes.
And some way or the other, I was always, bothered about that, what methodology actually I should select, because this is a institutional thing. We only need to talk about what Tezpur University has and how can it talk about this diversity and inclusiveness that you were talking about. And what methodology should I take so that the faculty members, the research scholars, the young minds who are there in the science and technology departments, they can think of their own careers. Now, this is something very important at this juncture, that how can these people be brought in together? Because there has to be a think tank where there has to be.
Madhurya, you have hit the nail on the head, that the institutional structures have to be developed. So, in fact, in the STEEP 2020, we have actually suggested not just policies that the Government of Science and Technologies or the government can implement, but we have actually suggested what institutions can do. That I feel that what is important is that the institutions have to take stock of different aspects of participation of women in science. How do we how do we encourage how do we encourage first women to study, but how do we also remake the non-women parts of the society, of the institutions, to realize that this is important for the whole institution. It is not just a project for women by women. I think that is, to me, the most important aspect. And then we need to actually, one of the things that I think has worked, and that's why I suggested already to you, things like this screening of the film, for example, which itself might give rise to some very specific action plans that the institution, the university can implement. For example, I believe one of the things that every university or any institution should do, in fact, is think of founding what I call equity and inclusion cell. So this is not a punitive body. This is not the internal complaints committee that one is talking about, but one is talking about a body which will look at holistically how to progress and increase the participation of women in science, and for that matter, all the other small groups. And therefore, having a cell on equity and inclusion, or having a cell of women in science education and research. So this is slightly different. I mean, this can be led by Women's Studies Center, but this is something that is slightly different than this has to be done together with natural scientists, and natural scientists and social scientists have to come together and implement these things. And I'm hoping that in Gati, this would happen. And as you know, I am a chair of the committee that oversees the Gati program. And I personally would be very happy to discuss more with you what University of Tezpur could concretely do in the framework of this project. Thank you very much.
So we can have a few questions. Ma'am needs to shift here or? You speak only.
I think you have to try. I cannot hear the question, if there is a question. If the person can come close to the mic. Madhurima, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. I think Govinda, she's make it here so that man can see her also. And keep your questions ready. So we go.
Hello.
Listening to you. And I just have a small suggestion. Yes, we are talking about women in science, and we are talking of the formalized study of science. But I think this today, with the, how shall I say, the porosity between subjects, disciplines, could we also have some opportunity for people who may not be majoring in science, but could take up a paper?
Sure, absolutely.
And have that on the curriculum for choice, so that, because as I read, I find people from sociology, humanities background have a different interpretation of situations.
Of
And
course,
that
of course.
could help.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, science means, whatever we study through scientific processes, whether it is sociology, whether it is some aspect of social science, it does not matter. It's the methodology that we talk about. So when I say science, I mean scientific studies.
Yes.
Okay, that's why I use a very general word called processes of science.
Mhm.
And that is where actually I would really, because one of the things that I have been sort of pushing, and actually this study that we did on the loss of this trained scientific movement power, and what fraction are we losing and why, you would be happy to know that it actually consisted 50% is natural scientists and 50% social scientists. And I believe that this thing has to be done jointly, because particularly the issue of women's participation in science is affected by, that is why I mentioned two things. It is affected by policies, but it is also affected by social mindsets, and how to affect social mindsets. And those social mindset means mindsets of the parents, mindsets of the students, mindset of the teachers, everywhere. And this requires actually interventions on the social angle also. So I could not agree with you more. Okay. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a very broad definition of science in my own mind.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Dr. Viren.
Mr. Golwale, for this wonderful talk of yours. It certainly touched upon many aspects, not just gender aspect of the equity inclusion, but I was fascinated by the way you presented and made it with the.
Can you move back? Can you move back from the mic? I'm not able to hear you well.
And now, am I audible?
Can you type? Because I'm not really able to hear your words. There is something in the audio system. Is there a chat box where you can type? No, there isn't. Okay, go ahead, because I'm not able to hear very well. Let's try again.
Can you now, ma'am?
Yeah, I can hear better now. Yes.
Okay. Can you louder? Bit louder?
Yeah, no, this is fine. What you're doing now is fine.
I just wanted to I commented on something, but now I should come to something which you mentioned in one of the earlier slides. You said that while commenting about someone named Larry Summers, I guess, the president
Yeah.
of Harvard University, you mentioned that we do not have our Larry Summers here in India.
Yeah.
What do you meant by that?
Okay, I will tell you. What I meant by that is that in the US or in the West, quite often, women are not even encouraged to study science by saying that there is no way, you don't have aptitude for it. I mean, I have had my young colleagues in the US whom I have met, who, when students went, and Germany also, where she went to an engineering class, and this was maybe 20 years ago. And when she was told, what are you doing in an engineering class? You should be going to take education in how to teach and teach students. At least in India, this does not happen. At least in the India of last 30 years, 40 years, nobody comes and says, why are you doing a degree in physics or mathematics, or women are not supposed to be able to do science and computer science, and don't enroll for these courses. This does not happen. Nor do the Indian girls say, oh, how can I do mathematics? That does not happen.
Yeah, that is there. But we would remember the case of Kamala Harper, let's say, who wanted to study, do her research in ISC in 1933.
But that is we are talking of 1932, right? What I'm saying today, today's India, this is now 100 years since then. And in 100 years, we have come a long way. But India, in the West world, Larry Summers was from 1900 and 2010. So in that sense, that is a big difference between India and the West right now, in that the fraction of students, women who study science, is quite large in India. And that's actually a fact which UNESCO, one of the UNESCO studies, has now released very recently. You can also look at the studies that are done by the Department of Higher Education. There are very nice surveys for the last 10 years. All India Survey of Higher Education, AISHE. There you can see that the fraction of students, women among students at all levels, in all classes of society, in all states, is actually quite substantial. This is what I mean by that statement. That we are not ruling out science education for girls out of hand. Our problems come in after they are educated to keep them in science. So our problems are different, therefore our solutions have to be different. That is the thing that I wanted to emphasize. Am I clear?
Yeah, thank you.
And let us add one point, please.
Yes.
You said 1932. You have Jana Kemal at that time.
Yes.
She had completed a BSc in India from Madras
Yes.
and then went on to be an amazingly well qualified, diversified scientist. So both
Yes.
sides of the story existed. Thank you.
Exactly. But what I meant was 1930 was the beginning of, for that matter, 1910 or, 5 was the beginning for, in general, for Indian people, Indian scientists to do science in a big way, because the Ramans, these people started around then, the Jagdish Chandra Bose and so on and so forth, in the late 1900s. Okay. So this is the beginning. What I meant was, the statement I made about Larry Summers was that it was India of today. It was the US of today, of 10 years ago. And that marks a big difference between India and the West, that we have a positive angle on our side in the beginning. This is all that I wanted to say. Okay.
Do we have, because we also need to, because Rohini ma'am,
Yes.
we have started our offline classes and we also need to go back to their classes. The students
Yes,
will
please.
go back to the classes
Yes,
also, so we will wrap up the session. But
Please do.
with the note that in Assam also, we are very shortly, we are going to do a study on history of, the women scientists in Assam. Like,
It's very nice.
your Leelavati daughters is very famous by this time.
No, please do this. I think it's very important.
Yes.
And we will come up with lot of knowledge and lot of surprises with such studies. So I wish you people a lot of luck for such studies. Okay.
Thank you. So in the end, I let me thank Professor Godbole from your side also, from Tezpur University. We are really, really thankful, ma'am. But as you have assured, next time you are going to be there physically. So that
Yeah. I hope to be
Yeah.
there, because if nothing else, I love Assam.
So we also try to visit.
Yeah. I have been to Tezpur before and I really love the place. So let me hope that someday I can actually make a
Yes,
visit.
yes, definitely. We are
And
looking
I'm
forward.
also impressed with the work you are doing. I wish you people a lot of luck. And I hope that something real good progress in your Gati can come along. Okay. And I would be happy to interact with you on that if necessary.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We would certainly like to have your ideas and your suggestions.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am.
Bye.
Yes,
Bye.
okay. Okay, and like it on there.